So I want to actually echo Rabbi Chait's initial remarks insofar as the idea or the struggle that Chazal had. Obviously, at the what Rabbi Chait said at the end clearly indicates it wasn't a struggle. But in the beginning, the struggle Chazal had insofar as creating the mitzvah of Chanukah. But what I want to focus on is the common notion that all of us have, which is that when we light Neros Chanukah, that somehow it's tied to the menorah of the Beis Hamikdash. So first of all, obviously, if you actually look at a menorah, or it was what we call today a Chanukah at home, you can notice pretty quickly that it can't be like the menorah of the Beis Hamikdash because there are 8. If those who have a Chanukah, there are 8 glasses or candle holders that are there, and the menorah obviously did not have that. It had 7. So when we usually look at zechers, a true zecher lemikdash usually, as much as possible, emulates what was done during that period of time. For instance, Korach. So for those who are Teimanim, get pretty close. So that you take your we don't have the Korban Pesach, but we try to emulate as much as possible. But here it's funny. The Chazal are masaking 8 days of lights, and everyone wants to draw back to the menorah, and yet the Chanukah itself, assuming there is such a thing as a Chanukah, in no way reflects or is clearly not in line with the model that the Beis Hamikdash represented. But I think that the deeper question is can we posit there is a tie between the menorah of the Beis Hamikdash and the Neros Chanukah? So to cut to the chase, yes, but of course I'd like to propose a theory as how that's possible. So we look back in the Gemara. Both the Gemara and Megillas Taanis present basically the same version of what the Chashmonim faced. In other words, after their let's assume they're at a pause or the end at the most victorious moment. So they were faced with this interesting thing where rather than sit back and have a victory party, they run to the Beis Hamikdash, and clearly it was not a good situation since the Beis Hamikdash was in a state of tumah. So since it was a state of tumah, they really couldn't do much. Their hands were tied. Now, what they could have done is they could have gone through the process of purifying themselves and then re-purified the Beis Hamikdash, but they didn't do that. Instead, the Gemara explains that the Gemara has a debate about how you can make a menorah, or what you can make a menorah with, and the Gemara concludes that a menorah, it was machlokes, but the Chashmonim used basically these spits of barzel, and they covered them with tin. And it's both listed in source number 1 and source number 2 as well. In Megillas Taanis, it says that they got to the Heichal, all the kelim were tameh, they had nothing to light with, right? And what it says is they brought these 7 spits of metal, and they covered them with tin, and then they went ahead and lit. So we're talking about a very rudimentary menorah. Again, machlokas whether that's really a kasha menorah or not, but it's an interesting thing that now again, what drove them to do that? Well, you find this little pach shemen that's tahor. So there isn't much to do with that. So they assumed we're going to use this to light something. So they go ahead and light this fabricated fall menorah, for lack of a better term. Of course, then the rest is history. As we know, they did that, and then today we light our Neros Chanukah as well. To try to understand what the tie is, we first have to understand what the purpose of the kelim and the Beis Hamikdash were, which is a very very difficult thing for those who pay attention during Kriyas Torah. So we know that the Torah spends an inordinate amount of time in describing the specific dimensions of each kli that was built for the Beis Hamikdash, for the Mishkan, the Beis Hamikdash. Parshas Truma and Tetzaveh, a little bit of Kisisa, Vayaka Pekudei's repetition, as we'll soon see even in Emor. Throughout the Torah, we see these extremely detailed descriptions of every amma, this material, that material. So the question is why? Why should that be the case? Why didn't the Torah just tell us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded Moshe to build these kelim, and that's it? All right, so maybe you'll say that we need the instruction manual for later on, okay? Which is not a bad answer. You could just say, listen, the Torah is giving us the manual. We know we're going to have to use this for the times of the Beis Hamikdash. This is what we look at. This is the source, the blueprint for what to do. But if you look at Rabbeinu Hananel, which is he's source 3, but he's on the second to last page. He gives an unbelievable pshat. He says he's commenting on the Shulchan. So he says Vasisa Shulchan. So he says the Shulchan was Keneged Malchei Yisrael. He says why they build the Shulchan. So as we all know, the Shulchan was where they put the lechem upon Haman. So why did they build the Shulchan? So it's Keneged Malchei Yisrael. It's Keneged the kings of Yisrael. Shemisajin al Shulchanim. Rabbi Yisrael, so that the Rabbi Yisrael come and are misader on their tables. And then he proceeds to go, insofar as the Shulchan is concerned, he proceeds to take each specific thing. A Masayim Arko represents an idea. This amount of Amos represents an idea. This specific, the Misgeris represents a certain idea. Each facet of the Shulchan had some idea, some idea attached to it that related to the greater concept of Malchei Yisrael. And if you look in the bottom where I marked off, it says Uklal Hadvar Mekeim Ma'ileh Ha'aron VaShulchan VaMenorah Mizbeach Ha'ola Umizbeach Hazav. So all the kalim that he just listed, Ha'aron Keneged HaTzadikim Tosei Torah. So the Aron, the idea of the Aron somehow relates to the Tzadikim. The Shulchan Neged Malchei Yisrael, the Menorah Keneged Chachmei Yisrael, Mizbach Hazav Keneged HaKohanim, Mizbach Ha'ola Keneged Yisrael. So each one of these kalim, right, in some way, represents some other concept. For instance, whether it be tzaddikim, whether it be chachmei Yisrael, each one of these requires its own shir. But there's something going on here that's clearly not. These things were not meant as ornamental. They weren't meant to be artistic displays in the temple. Rather, they served as some type of vehicle. If you look at number 4 in the Sefer Chinuch, so he's writing this when it comes to Big Day Kahuna. When we talk about Kalim in the Beis HaMikdash, there's really 2 types. There are the actual, let's say, vessels themselves, and there's the other reference for Kalim are the begadim, the clothing the Kohanim wore. So he explains there, and he says the same thing also by the Kalim, but it's a little clearer here. He says, Mishar Shem Mitzvah, Sefer Chinuch is such a critical sefer for everyone to own. He really gets into the format of how mitzvahs, what a mitzvah is, and what its philosophical source is. So he explains that the Hayisod Kavul Lana Ki Adam Nifal Lefi Pulosav V'Achareim Machshavosav V'Kamanasav. So we know that a man is really defined by his actions, and afterwards his thoughts and intents. V'Hashaliach HaMechaper Tzarech Lahaspis Kol Machshavasav V'Kamanasav Elavoda. So he's referring to the Kohen Gadol. When the Kohen Gadol is working, right, his entire intent, every part of his mind must be focused on Avodas HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Al Kain Royally Slavish Begadim Yichadam Eileha. So therefore, that's why it's roy for him to wear these clothing, these unique clothing. Any place the Kohen Gadol will look on his body, any place he would look at, right? Miyad nizkar misor belibo lifnei mihu oved. He immediately will be reminded that he's standing before HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that he is serving God. V'zek ein tefillin shenistavo kol lahaniach b'ksasa guf sheyeli zikar machshav esachar. So similarly, tefillin works in a similar way. Just as an example, for instance, the Kohen Gadol wore me'il. So the me'il had these little bells on the bottom of it. So the Ramban explains that every time he would walk around, he'd hear these bells. Why? So the Ramban says as a constant reminder that he's involved in Avodas HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So what I want to propose, which is I think pretty obvious from these sources, is that each kli, each beged, every single part of the Beis HaMikdash is a vehicle to some type of idea. That's its function. Of course, it has a practical utility in the Beis HaMikdash itself. The Mizbeach was there for sacrifices and korbanos. But when we study it, when we look at the Kalim, we shouldn't look at them as simply utility, but rather each one has an idea. Each one is a vehicle to some type of idea. And we see that by the Chinuch's interpretation of the Big Day Kahuna. So if that's the case, if each one's a vehicle to a certain idea, let's see if we can apply that to the menorah. If you look in source 5, the Torah tells us a very interesting thing. The Torah recaps, I would say recap, the Torah describes the implementation of both the menorah and the shulchan. So the Torah tells us, by the Hashem Moshe Lemor, Tzaves b'nei Yisrael v'chul lecha Shem en zayzach chatzis la'ma'or la'los ner tamid, and then it says michutz le'paroches la'idus b'ol moed. So the place would be outside the paroches and the ol moed, and it describes what Aaron would have to do. Immediately afterwards, it describes the baking of the lechem upon him. V'lachachtas solos v'afisa osach shnei mesrei chalos shnei ashnim yeh chalah ha'achas. All right, so we have these two kalim. And their two functions right next to each other in the Torah. So the Rashbam picks up on that. The Rashbam is bothered by, why do we have these two things together? So he says, in number 6, so he says, this parsha is brought here, is taught here, menorah nochach hashulchan laha'ir el hashulchan she'alav lechem apanim shemefurish kan. So what he explains very simply. If you look at the map of the Beis HaMikdash, where the shulchan was, the menorah was right next to it. So what was the menorah doing? And it's an amazing thing what he's proposing. If you would think about it, what would a menorah do? Why would you have a menorah in the Beis HaMikdash? To light it up? right? What do lights do? They illuminate. And yet the Rashbam is telling you that the Shulchan did not illuminate the Beis HaMikdash. Rather, what did it illuminate? It illuminated the Shulchan. All right, Lahar El HaShulchan she'alav lechem upon him. That on it are the lechem upon him. Right? And then he says, Shemiforish kan shekol zeh metikun HaShulchan u'misidurav. So it's interesting. He says this is all part of the. It's very. You got to pay attention to his language. From the function of the Shulchan and from its order. Hashemen lahayir b'pas la'aruch. Okay, so the shemen is there, meaning the menorah is there to light, and the pas la'aruch. It's astonishing. According to Rashbam, the menorah really was an extension of the Shulchan. It wasn't actually, and of course it was an independent kli, but from a functional standpoint, as he says, it was built into the very construct of the Shulchan itself. So the question is, what do we care? Great. What do we learn from that? So it's interesting. The real question you have to ask is, what therefore was the function of the menorah, according to the Rashbam? What was its purpose? What was it doing? And you have to be careful when you answer this, because if you think about it, every single thing in the Beis HaMikdash had a practical function, meaning you did something with it. There was kli shares, you carried it around. Or the mizbeach, you did stuff on the mizbeach. But this, what's the menorah doing? It's just illuminating. What kind of maisa is illuminating? What kind of action it is? Is it just to simply illuminate? So it could be what he's telling us is that the purpose of the menorah, at least according to Rashbam at this point, is to basically serve as an indicator. In other words, when it lit up, when it brought light onto the Shulchan, it was telling people, or it was presenting a message that the lechem upon him are here, and that the Shulchan is active. As long as the menorah was lit, the idea that was expressed was that the Shulchan was active, it was open for business as well. So according to Rashbam, the menorah did serve to illuminate, but what was it illuminating? It was illuminating the Shulchan to indicate that the Shulchan was operating appropriately. The Rambam, though, has a much, much, much different interpretation. That's what I really want to focus on. The Rambam does not say that. The Rambam in the Menorah Nevuchim, in the next source, in number 7, he writes about the menorah, and he says, what was it? He says it was there lechavol ultiferes lebayis. All right, it was to honor. It was really and beautify the Beis HaMikdash. Ki habayis shedolik bo aner tamid, because any house that has a candle lit constantly in it, right? Hanistar b'paroches yeshlo benefesh mala gedola. So it affects a person. Why? So we know already from the Torah the importance and of the Beis HaMikdash and to be in awe of it. Ad she'agil adam midas anava, until man is overwhelmed by humility. So basically, the essential idea of the Rambam is that the purpose of the menorah was when you would know about the light or see the light, it would affect a person and bring him to a state of anivus. That's very problematic, because the problem is, what then is the function of the menorah? According to the Rambam, it's a functionless kli. I mean, it's not doing anything. It's the candle's lit. Okay, and now what? So what's it doing? It's just producing light? But yet the Rambam says somehow this effect happens to you, which is not the normal way you would look at a candle. A candle illuminates. The Rambam is not in any way, shape, or form saying that the function of the menorah was to illuminate anything whatsoever. So if it's not there to illuminate, then what's the purpose of the menorah? And not only that, I'd ask another question on that. The other question I would ask is, isn't the whole idea of the Beis HaMikdash itself to bring you to Yira? The Rambam talks about it elsewhere, that the knowledge of the Beis HaMikdash itself produces Yira in an Adam. When you do Ola Rega, when you went up to the Beis HaMikdash 3 times a year, there was a natural awe you would feel. Nothing to do with the menorah, had to do with being in this environment. So what is unique about the menorah? Well, it doesn't sound like the menorah is adding anything. Rather, it sounds like it's superfluous. So how do we understand the function of the menorah? And I think if we can develop an idea for the Rambam, this could tie into what Chazal did when it came to putting together Ner Chanukah. So I think you could say it like this. In other words, every kli, as I mentioned before, has a utility to it. Every kli has a function. Now, if that's the case, it's natural to think that the way to really benefit from whatever the function of the kli is would be through its usage itself. All right. So if I use a kli, in other words, if I'm in the Beis HaMikdash and I'm able to use a kli, so the usage would give me that tie, that push to understanding whatever that idea is. That's one point. The other point, and you'll see how tied together, is that when we look at a light, I would argue there's really 2 purposes or 2 components to how you can identify a light, or what a light is. So actually functions. One function is that it illuminates. That's the obvious one. Right? We know that if a room is dark, right, what's a light going to do? It's going to light up the room. But there's another thing a light does. A light also functions. Now you got to picture from this perspective. If you're walking in a dark area and you see the light in the distance, so what's that light doing? It's not illuminating because you really can't see much in that dark area. But what it is doing is that it's drawing you in. Okay, it draws you to the light. You see that light and you're drawn to it. All right, that's another way we relate to light. One way is light is purely functional; it illuminates. But there's another way that a light, and again, if you look at it that way, light draws you in. If that's the case, I can understand what the Rambam's saying. I think we can say that what the Rambam's telling us is that just like every kli functions in some way as a vehicle to a certain idea, the menorah as well does this through its lights. When you see the ner should draw you in to thinking about the Beis HaMikdash. But the thing is like this. I would say what makes the menorah different, all right, and again, this is key because I don't think there's a practical purpose to this. It's not a utility. What the ner was doing was sending an important message to Klal Yisrael. And I think Chazal took this message and used it when they put together the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah. See, as I mentioned before, what a person would think to himself is that the only way I could ever really gain from the ideas of the Kalim of the Beis HaMikdash is to be able to use them. We got a big problem with that, though. The problem is that only people like me, as a Kohen, my son, possibly, right? And that's it. We're basically making use of these Kalim. What about the rest of Klal Yisrael? Klal Yisrael are locked out of the Beis HaMikdash. This is a struggle, those of us who are familiar with Korach, this is a struggle that that Bnei Yisrael have over and over again with the relationship that they have with the Beis HaMikdash. In a sense, the average Jew will never, lahavdil, get his hands on a kli. He's never going to access it. So what I want to posit is that the menorah was set up as the kli to indicate to Klal Yisrael that it's bidavka not through practical usage that a person can access the ideas of the Kalim, but rather just to study them per se. A person can open up a Chumash, he can look at them before Shem, he can open up Gemara, and he can see the ideas of the Kalim, and he can benefit in that way. It's not necessary to actually make use of the Kalim in order to benefit from it. Rather, a person can study it even though he's a million miles away and will never ever in his life hold that kli of the Beis HaMikdash. That is what's unique about the menorah. The menorah is a non-practical kli. Its purpose is to demonstrate that not every kli is really set up for that. It's not through practical usage that a person gains the ideas. Rather, it's simply knowledge of what the kli is. And like Rabbeinu Chananah mentions before, any person can access that information. It's there for Klal Yisrael. So I think that's the idea. That notion is what I think Chazal borrow when it comes to creating Ner Chanukah. And I'll show that in a second. If you look at source 8, so this is a very famous idea in the Rambam. The Rambam spends an inordinate amount of time in Hilchos Megillah Chanukah recapping the story of the Chashmonaim. I think I mentioned this to some of the guys in Yeshiva. There's a famous pshat given. So again, he goes into very great detail. Bayesheni Kishamalchu Yavan, Gazuk Zeros. It's almost like a specific history, a historical recount of what took place. So it's interesting. If we're familiar with the Rambam was a sefer. The Mishnah Torah was a sefer of halacha. There are certain times where it's not purely the case. For instance, in Hilchos of Avodas Kochavim, he does go through the history of Avodah Zarah, but in general, the Rambam wrote the Mishnah Torah as a sefer of halacha. Yeah, what does he do here? He spends all this time going through the history of what took place. So why does he do that? Why not just cut to the chase, stick to normal halacha like he does with Megillah, and say, this is the halacha of Neros, this is what you have to do, this is what you can't do, etc., etc. He doesn't. He gives us 3 halachas, really 2.5, where he goes through in detail what took place. So the answer, which is a well-known answer, is that what the Rambam's showing you is that knowledge of the history of what took place was actually part of the very halachic structure of Ner Chanukah. When we light Ner Chanukah, and like I said before, the Ner draws you in. It's not that the Ner Chanukah are not there to illuminate. They have no function of illuminating whatsoever. Rather, they draw you in. When you see the Ner Chanukah, you're supposed to think about the Nisim. You're supposed to think about the story, how the Greeks tried to destroy us, tried to destroy our ideology, and how HaKadosh Baruch Hu intervened on our behalf, etc., etc. So the idea is, the Rambam's telling you that built into the very halachic structure of Ner Chanukah is the notion of understanding the events that took place. Even more so, the Rav writes it's on the last page, the Rav writes in Hari Kedem, or written in his name in Hari Kedem, he gives a phenomenal, very, very fascinating possibility where he says, and he quotes the Rambam, which is Halacha Gimel on the original sources, where the Rambam says, so because of this, the Chachamim were misakin in that generation, that these 8 days, Yemei Simcha v'Halel, there'll be days of Simcha and Halel, and then he says, Umadlikin bahen esaneres be'erev al pischei habatim. So he says, and they will light on those days the candles in the evening at the front of their houses. That's again, the average person would never pick up on the diuk, but the Rav says there's a big problem. Why didn't the Rambam write? He should have written Yemei Simcha v'Halel, right? And Halachas Neros. In other words, there's one idea of Chanukah, and the idea of Chanukah is comprised of three components. There's Simcha, Halal, and Halachas Neros. But he separates out Umadlikin. He says Simcha, Halal, comma, and then he says Umadlikin, or he treats it as a separate. I'm putting the comma in myself. But he treats it as a separate idea. Why? So the Rav wants to say like this. He wants to say that he's unsure if during the times of the Beis HaMikdash, meaning the second Beis HaMikdash, did they light Ner Chanukah? Did everyone in their houses light Ner Chanukah during the times of the second Beis HaMikdash? The Rav wants to say, no. He wants to say that there's no reason to. He says, Lefish nero shetiknu haim b'makam hamenorah shebemikdash. Ugedei lefarsem esaneis shel hamenorah. Lefikach zman takanazu he rak la'achar hachorban zecher lemenorah shebemikdash. So since the idea, which we'll tie in a second, since the idea of Nero's Chanukah was tied into the menorah, so therefore it would be superfluous for every person to light Ner Chanukah during the times of the second Beis HaMikdash, which is an amazing thing. It means that during that period of time, you had nobody lighting Ner Chanukah in their houses. All right? So that's why, according to the Rambam writes it this way. He writes, Yemei Simcha v'Halal. And then, Umadlikin. But what's he separating? He's saying that the kana of being madlik in your house wasn't chal until after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. After that moment, so then the takana held, or the halacha held, that you should go ahead and light in your houses. So the Rav is really showing us that there's a natural tie between the two. But I want to go even further than what the Rav is saying, and this to me is the main point here. In other words, if the Ner is not there to go ahead and illuminate, all right, we see that by the Menorah in the Beis HaMikdash, according to the Rambam, the Ner is not, its function is not to illuminate. Rather, it's there to draw you in. And similarly speaking, the Ner in Chanukah is also there to draw you in. So what do we see that Chazal did? What Chazal wanted to do was they borrowed the idea that existed in the Menorah, the notion of a Ner drawing you in, and they put that into Ner Chanukah as well. It's not that we're trying to mimic the actual Kli itself of the menorah, because that's absurd. If you look at our menorahs today, there are 8. For those who use a menorah, there are 8 candles on there. No, it's the Ner. It's the idea of a candle being a vehicle to a certain idea, to be a non-illuminating candle. If you look at number 10, the halacha is, can you use a lit candle that was previously lit? A shashish, ayasu, delekas kol yom, kula moti shabbos, mechabe, umevarach malika. Now, of course, the reason is because halakha osa mitzvah, but there's a critical halachic idea here. You cannot use what's called a ner shel tashmish. What's a ner shel tashmish? What's the purpose of a normal candle? To illuminate. All right? You can't use, the purpose of Ner Chanukah is not to illuminate. Rather, it functions as a draw-in. You look at the candle, and it draws you into a certain idea. So what I want to say is that what Chazal did, they looked at the menorah, and I think the Chashmonim had this in mind, but they looked at the menorah and they saw the function of the neros, the candles in the menorah, has nothing to do with any utility, but rather it was a vehicle to certain ideas. And they took that concept and they applied it to Neros Chanukah. And they said Neros Chanukah should function in the same exact way. When you see Ner Chanukah, you see it as a bracha, birchas haroah. When you see it, and you say Sha'asa Nisim, you're drawn in, you see the story, you see the Nisim. The same way it functions as a vehicle in the Beis HaMikdash, it should function as a vehicle for us as well when we are engaged in the midst of Ner Chanukah. To me, it's a very, very unique idea. It shows you the brilliance of Chazal, that whenever it comes to areas like this, rather than just think on an emotional level, they are able to break down categorically something, for instance, like light, and demonstrate that you would think that light simply has a functional aspect, but at the same time, light also has an idea where it draws you in. And I think that main point is how they were able to construct this entire mitzvah of Ner Chanukah. So with that, thank you very much for coming, and may we merit the rebuilding the Beis HaMikdash in the future. B'mihra v'yameinu.